Picture this. The journey ahead starts here together, and together we can build a brighter future. You are listening to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. Dr. Sara Brammer began working as an overnight victims advocate in the field of family violence in 1994. She continued working as a therapist for victims and offenders as she completed her Master's and Doctoral Degree in Counselor Education and Counseling Psychology at the University of Missouri. While in her doctoral program, her research and dissertation focused on love relationships and Batterer's Intervention treatment. She is currently the Vice President of the Family Violence Services at Synergy Services, where she has worked for 23 years. She supervises the Domestic Violence Center, the Children's Center, the Domestic Violence Housing Program, the Batterer's Intervention Program, and outpatient domestic violence clinical services in this capacity. She provides frequent training on domestic violence and the intersection between domestic violence, child abuse, and trauma. She has also served on a variety of local, state, and national committees related to domestic violence and child abuse service provisions. Her research interests continue to focus on love relationships, batterer's intervention, and victim services. Dr. Brammer has successfully led the agency through 2 flawless COA reaccreditations and is a lead peer reviewer for other agencies. Sara was commissioned by the Missouri Supreme Court for Best Practices Committee on Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking. She has received technical assistance from Futures and the Center for Justice Innovations for statewide offender intervention implementation. Additional achievements include partnering with the Domestic Violence Court to offer exclusive offender intervention services, guest editing for the Journal of Children and Family Studies, and collaboration with Yale University to implement the Child and Family Trauma Stress Intervention Program. Sara also represents Missouri on the National BIP Network, and she serves on the advisory board for the University of Missouri's Community Counseling and Assessment Service Center. Welcome to the Illuminating Hope podcast. Glad you're here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
When I am out speaking to, it doesn't matter if it's a group of therapists or organizations, one question I always am asked is, what about the abuser? I always say Synergy Services has a Batterer's Intervention Program. So can you describe the typical structure of the program for our listeners, and then how long does it last? What does it involve?
Well, we appreciate Hope House's support with our offender program, and we appreciate the referrals you guys send. The typical structure of our domestic violence offender program is, first of all, there's an assessment, and that assessment is designed to build a relationship with the offender, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but offenders are more amenable to treatment, if you will, if they have a relationship with the person talking to them. We try to build a relationship with the offender. That relationship takes approximately 4 weeks. We have one of the longer assessments in the country, and the function of that is to provide a psychological profile of the domestic violence offender. When that comes in handy the most is when the offender does something egregious, as sometimes happens. We can get, those records could be subpoenaed by the court, and we can provide that kind of backup information to a court that could help them in the prosecution of some bad behavior. Once they get through the assessment, our program works a tad bit differently than most. Most programs have a one-size-fits-all model. Ours does not. Our model looks at a number of factors. Our model looks at lethality of the offender. So when the behavior is reported by the offender, how lethal is it? Is there strangulation involved? Was the victim pregnant? Was there a firearm used? Automatically, they get more weeks than someone who had maybe a lesser offense. Because what that means to me and my team is that this offender has been doing this for a while. And his control over his victim when he's seriously assaulting her is significant. And his treatment needs to be longer, both for him and for the survivor. more. And so once we have all the lethality information and the history of use of force and all of those things, then we staff that with a multidisciplinary team, because I may see something that someone else does not, or vice versa. And we really want everyone to be involved in the decision, because then if it comes down to the line, then the team supports the decision. So there have been cases where every one of us signed a letter to the court, like, this person is dangerous, and there's 13 signatures. That means a lot more than just my signature on the line. So once all of that information is gathered, the offender is recommended to an amount of treatment. 26 weeks is the national standard. That came literally from Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar's original curriculum that took the power and control wheel and divided it into those pies and then said 3 weeks for each topic. That's how 26 weeks came about. How I know that is I had to call Michael Paymar, who was retired, and say, why is this 26 weeks? And he said, great question. Not many people ask that. It's because of that pie wheel. So I said, what do you do beyond that? And then you have to look at some of the more extensive research, like Gondoff's research, which says the longest and most extensive programs are the most effective for victim safety. When an offender has used a lethal means of force, or potentially lethal, then we believe longer treatment is necessary, and we lean into Gondoff's work and have a longer program. So we use 26 weeks for an assessment where the offender does not pose much lethal threat to his victim. As lethality increases, so does the number of weeks. 52 is the typical longest we go, which allows us to monitor the offender over a very long time and provide support for the survivor as well. Once we make a recommendation, we send the offender to one of our groups, and they are provided with some basic education first and a group orientation, if you will, and then they participate in a group that's gender specific. We do have a women's offender group, but that group is fairly small, but the offender groups is fairly large. So they'll go into a group, it's open so they can come anytime, and they'll participate in one of the groups we have with other offenders. They come in, they check in, and then in the first week the guys will ask them questions about what they did to get here. What's most effective is when the other offenders challenge the offender that's new into really disclosing what he actually did to the survivor. That's where the magic is. I can say it all day long, but at the end of the day, an offender saying it to another offender is way more powerful.
I am often asked, what's the difference between the Batterer's Intervention Program and anger management?
It's a great question. There's a lot of differences, and actually I have a great handout about that at the office. Anger management was a philosophical foundation that was built in the early 80s, late 70s, and the idea of that was that behavior that is violent is learned and can then be unlearned with a certain psychoeducational approach to treatment. It's typically 8 to 12 weeks, and it doesn't involve much more than psychoeducation. So let me tell you how not to be abusive. That in the long-term research looks like it may make offenders more abusive. So what it essentially tells an offender is how to not appear angry. Anger isn't really the problem. Most offenders don't present angry. They present very calculated. And so if you start looking at those kind of things, then potentially anger management isn't the problem. And if it makes them worse, then we absolutely shouldn't do that. Fortunately, most of the states in the country, including the District of Columbia, don't allow anger management anymore. Most states have standards for batterers intervention that require a laid out curriculum. And we certainly have a laid out curriculum that follows both Duluth and Emerge, but most states disallow it. But it's very common. We can disallow it at the state levels. Courts can still order it. That's how this idea has flourished, because it's short, right? If you're checking a series of boxes and batterers intervention anger management is on there, you're going to check the box that makes the offender more likely to be effective in the approach. The challenge is it doesn't work. So it may be checking the box, it may be putting the victim in more danger.
Which that just requires then more education education with the courts.
Absolutely.
Around what is effective, because really domestic violence isn't anger.
It's
domestic
not.
Violence is about power and control.
It absolutely
So
is.
it really doesn't do any good, especially if you're picking and choosing who you're angry with and what you're going to do, and it's about the person you're in the relationship with. That's not about controlling your anger. That's about controlling another individual.
That's a great point, Marianne. I think that what often people mistake as anger is actually a desire for control,
Right.
which is why intermittent explosive disorder and those kinds of things that appear in media often don't work for domestic violence offenders. They aren't intermittently explosive. I've never been assaulted. They are targeted, and that's what makes them not eligible for that diagnosis. But you're absolutely right. This isn't about anger.
So when you're talking about the abusive individual, we work in domestic violence, and that is the question that often comes because people are trying to understand how can somebody do this to someone that they say that they love and that they want to be in a relationship with. From your work with the abusers, are they mentally ill? Do they have diagnosis? Or is this a combination? Or talk about what you see as that person that's coming to you, sitting down, you're doing the assessment with them. What are the characteristics? Are there any that are similar among all of them?
Well, I think that is a question I get asked quite often. The truth is we do not provide diagnoses for our offenders for a variety of reasons. The leading reason, though, is that a domestic violence offender will use whatever they can as an excuse to be abusive. For example, if I say they have narcissistic personality disorder, they will go back and gives them the opportunity to tell their survivor, see, I'm mentally ill. There's nothing I can do about it. And a lot of that has been really gleaned from the literature. One of the things that I had the good fortune to do was write my dissertation on domestic violence offenders. So one of the things I was able to do is really look at the literature, and that came out of the literature. So we don't normally provide a diagnosis. We don't normally see a consistent pattern of mental illness. Oftentimes people say, oh, I saw a TikTok and my offender must have narcissistic personality disorder. And I often try to slow them down. I'm like, that may be true. But the truth is they make a choice anyway, because how many times have I been assaulted? The number is 0. So when you think about that, why are they not assaulting me? It's not like they wouldn't wish for me to be in control.
Right.
Why wouldn't they choose to change my behavior? And they don't. So it's a choice,
Right.
which it means that it's not indicative of a diagnosis.
Right. I really appreciate that because I think that we try to come up with explanations as to why these behaviors exist. It makes more sense to say, okay, but if they have this mental health issue, then we can fix that and then we'll fix their behavior, when that isn't the reality of it. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I do think we need to just come to terms with that these people are exhibiting these behaviors. We have a lot of reasons that we could talk about that, but let's just deal with that.
One of the things that women are taught in our culture is that A plus B equals C. If I have a test and I study enough, I won't do bad on it. A plus B equals C. So if I do bad on a test, that means I did something wrong.
Right.
This is a message that's particularly sent to women in our culture. Men, not so much. Men are really able to dodge a lot of things, and that's society trained. So one of the things we have to do is really not look for the reason why and assume blame on ourselves, because ultimately the back end of that question is, what did I do? If not a diagnosis, then I must have done something wrong. And creatively, the offender's telling them they did something wrong. This is something you did. That's why you're to blame,
Right.
Which is not true. Offenders and victims don't have incidents because the victim did something wrong. Offenders have incidents because they made a choice to abuse their partner.
Correct. And so I'm assuming that is part of the conversation you're having with them in the group. So can you talk a little bit about what goes into that, let's just say a 26-week program that someone might be in?
Sure. We look at all kinds of different variables. The first one being accountable. The offender needs to be accountable for their behavior. What did you do? What was the harm you caused to your partner, to your children, to society? What was the general cost of this violence? What were the gains for your behavior? Well, how did you benefit from abusing your partner? And that's a really hard challenge. Another piece that's very difficult for offenders to try on for size is the fact that their abuse makes them maybe an abusive father. They very much struggle with that, and the most difficult conversations I've had with offenders have been around this idea that perhaps the person you impacted the largest was your children. Because often offenders come in with this idea, and almost all of them, that must be in some, handbook of how to be abusive. I'm a good dad. Can you be a good dad and abuse the kid's mother? The answer to that is no. That is one of the things that we really talk about quite a bit. We also focus on power and control. What ways have you abused her? Offenders think about the idea that I hit her, or I shoved her, or I called her out of her name. There's so many other ways you can be abusive to a partner, and what exactly did you do and why? Why did you make that choice? Then once they can be accountable, then we slow down the what happened in the event. Oftentimes offenders will say, well, I don't know, I just blew up and lost it. The truth of the matter is that there's a long pattern of violence. They have a period of stress building where you can watch it and the offender can identify it, and we ask them to. And then an incident, and then a period of manipulation where they do everything in their power to keep the survivor safe. And so we talk about all of those things, and then how to stay out of that. So how not to do this. We also talk about sexual violence and responsibility and the importance of child support and all of those pieces, because her choice is what really matters, or his choice. Men and women can both be victims and offenders. We just see men doing it much more, which is consistent with the other violent crimes in our country. Rapes, murders, mostly committed by men.
I guess this question's twofold. How do you keep your staff safe, and how do you measure success when you are talking about abusers?
So that is a two-part question. The
Definitely,
first question is, how do we keep our staff safe? It was a really big challenge for a number of years. We were live. We met in Parkville. There wasn't a bus line. It was at night, so there was nobody in the building. So we hired security. We paid more to keep my staff safe, myself and my staff safe, than we received in money from the offenders every week. So we would have 6 running groups, and we paid out more to the officers that were required to be on site to keep me safe than we received in revenue from the group. As we did that, and we were committed to doing that, we believe that's a service to survivors more and our community, it just became very difficult to wrap your head around that. Like, my safety, is it really more important than a survivor? I mean, we really had to tinker with that idea. Ultimately, the pandemic, if we're looking for some benefits of that, really helped because we took everything virtual. Everything was allowed to go virtual. And then there was a lot of good trainings developed about how to be an effective therapist online. And our HR department required that we be tested and trained in how to do that, which was great. And ultimately, when we came back, I came back armed with statistics about who are the mass shooters. Most of those people have been impacted by domestic violence.
Yes, 100%.
And so we're inviting these people into our agency and saying to them, don't be violent here. Well, we know that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So let's not have them here. Let's do it virtual. So we've worked with all kinds of people to make that happen. We worked with the state of Missouri's Supreme Court and with others, including Eileen Sheehan, who works for Hope House, to really build a program that could be virtual for the whole state. Because there's deserts in Missouri where there are no Batterers Intervention services provided. So we had to work with the Missouri Supreme Court. We had to work with Missouri Probation and Parole to get our program allowed to stay virtual. And they did. We keep our staff safe by having our offenders elsewhere.
Right, that's a win.
So, yeah, it is absolutely a win, and it saves us quite a bit of money. People ask me when I tell that kind of path towards virtual services whether I liked it better in person. And there are some strengths to each approach. Do I like being in person with offenders to really make an impact? I do. There were some really great strengths about that approach. Do I like keeping my staff safe? That actually gives me more peace of mind than knowing I can be more impactful if I am in person. I think that if you can do it correctly and you've been trained to provide virtual services, that's the best way to do it.
I think that we found that as well, that it gives another opportunity to engage with people in a way that you wouldn't have been able to engage before. So someone who doesn't have transportation or doesn't have child care, that you can continue to have the opportunity to work with them. Or I'm guessing then being virtual has allowed you to expand your scope of where you take your referrals from then as well, because there's not a lot of programs in Missouri that are offering this service.
That's true.
So then how has that helped you to be able to get into those more, the rural communities or communities that don't have such a service?
Absolutely, the virtual services have been tremendously helpful for providing treatment across Missouri. I think that one of the things that we have really focused on doing is finding successful means to disseminate virtual avenues which offenders can get onto our service. We send Kindles out to an offender. We charge it to their account. They're fairly inexpensive for domestic violence shelters who are not-for-profits to purchase. And it allows the offender to have access. There were a number of elements that allowed for us to move in that direction. I really appreciate all the hard work that was done by the state representatives and state officials to allow that. It really did help so many avenues by which to provide treatment across Missouri. So it has extended our scope. It's also provided all kinds of funding for us that we didn't expect. So we have received VAWA funding for some of our work. We also received Missouri Foundation for Health funding that has allowed us to expand our services.
That's awesome.
I'm noticing that you're calling them offenders, so I'm assuming they are convicted of domestic violence, or is this a fact?
They may have been convicted. Being adjudicated isn't a reason to not be admitted to our program or to be admitted. We often prefer for the offender to be through court. Offender, there's so many issues that are associated with whether you call them batterer or offender. It is considered politically more correct to say offender. It's considered even more politically correct than that to say person who uses force. For me, it's difficult to change my language. I used batterer's intervention for so long, and interestingly enough, my dissertation was qualitative. So I asked offenders what they needed from service and what they thought of the programming. And one of the questions I asked them was, what do you think of the title batterer? Or what should we use to describe you? Or people who use force. And the names that they came up with were far worse than offender or batterer. They used some pretty graphic slang for men who are abusive. And so we don't use that. Often am amused by all the discussion about what to call them. And I'm like, the guys say to call them batterers. It's fine. It's way more polite than what they're thinking about themselves in their head. So we call them batterers or offenders. There's movements across the country to change the name of offender services. It all boils down to the same topic. Offenders use force. They could be adjudicated. That doesn't indicate that they are or not. If they have admitted to being abusive, then they're offenders.
Does the offender graduate from your batterer's intervention, or what does that look like?
Many years ago, we erased the word graduation from our language, partially because they haven't graduated from anything. They don't get a cookie for learning to not beat their wives or partners. They get a certificate of attendance. They attended our program and made a choice every day to not abuse their partner. One of the neat things about our program is we allow offenders to participate free of charge for the rest of their lives as long as they remain non-abusive. So we provide a support system for men. We do have guys who do that. One of the guys in one of our later in the week groups, I have treated him since I was pregnant with my youngest child. That child is almost 17. So he's been in our program for 17 years. We know his partner, we know him, we know a lot about him. And I can say, do you remember when you wouldn't let the kiddo eat the Halloween candy? And he's always like, why do you not forget this stuff? And I'm like, I don't know. What I can say is there's some benefits in allowing men or women to complete and stay, but not graduate.
That question comes a lot from the other side as well.
Mm-hmm.
So first, what do you call? Do you call them victims? Do you call them battered women? Do you call them survivors? And because you're trying to be gender neutral, so that it feels very familiar when you talk about. There's a lot of conversation about which is the right. So I think we have to use what feels right to us,
right.
And that's what what we go with. But I think when I think about graduation, two things come. One is we get asked a lot is what are the success, or how do you define success? Success is very different for everybody, and it's how they define success rather than how we define success. When it comes to the abusive person, you can't guarantee that somebody isn't going to make that choice in the future. The only person who can guarantee they will remain abusive free is if they choose to remain that way. Do people ask you about what is success for you?
Almost every time I speak anywhere, the
Right.
first question or one of the early questions is, do they change? I always giggle when that question comes up and say, that's the most common question I get. And it's a little bit like asking this joke. How many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? Depends on if the light bulb really wants to change. And that's true for offenders too. Their behavior is effective. They get what they want. They may lose intimacy, not sex, but closeness to their partner, trust, but they often gain what they're looking for, which is control. We talk about that a lot. I can't force an offender to make change. I can provide them an avenue by which they can understand it better, but they still will have to choose every day for the rest of their lives. We provide them with support to do that by allowing them to remain in our program. We have a lot of offenders who still pay, even though we've waived their fee, and they create a scholarship for men who are going through the process.
That's amazing.
That's nice.
Well, we try a lot of different things. They come up with that on their own. Offenders decided to begin that process. And so we have created some home bases for people to really get the support that they need. But back to that change question. What do we consider success? We have a lot of criteria for success. We want them to be familiar with their cycle. We want offenders to know how to articulate that they can change their behavior. Like, we do all the right things, like theoretically about what they are supposed to do. And ultimately, we view success if we were able to reach out to that survivor and offer her resources, whatever they may be, to Hope House, to Rosebrook Center, to Synergy Shelter. We want to provide the survivor resources. And that may be their children or a variety of other people involved in the system. But that survivor knows she has someone in her corner if she needs it. If the offender thinks that's us as well, that's great. If that person doesn't, we understand that too. It's difficult to be ordered to something and like it. If you think about it, if you were ordered to participate in a bubble bath every Thursday night at 6 o'clock sharp, how long would it take you to be sick of it? Not very long. There's not enough bubble balls, like little bath bombs, to put in there if you're Patrick Mahomes that can get you that. And so you'd get sick of it. You'd want control back. So it's hard to keep people wanting to participate. And that's a challenge. We wish to support the survivor.
For our listeners' sake, take me into the mind of an abuser. Take me into the mind of an abuser and then share with us what tools you're going to give that abuser when they really want to take control. I know we give victims tools all the time, or survivors tools all the time, whether it be self-care or whatever we would have them to do. But take me into the mind of an abuser and what kind of tools help or has helped in the past.
One of the questions is, take me into the mind of an abuser. What are they thinking when they're abusive? And then what can be done? So remind me of that second question after I answer the first one. Oftentimes when offenders come to group, their rhetoric that they say in their head, the rhetoric that you ask when, like, do I look okay in this? And that never really is a good judge of what actually you look like in the mirror, right? But offenders have that voice too. That very self-sabotaging voice that says, no, she's wrong. I'm right. I can punish her. That is, and I'm using gender-specific pronouns because we very much see that predatory kind of behavior from men who are abusive. Women abuse often for different reasons, and I can answer that question as well. But for male abusers, they often are convinced or convince themselves that what they're doing is their right, that they have a right and almost a duty to correct their partner's behavior. And that no one has the right to tell them that they're wrong. And that's where they get into this really staunch belief that they're right. That everyone in the system, pro-feminist court, all of this stuff, is designed to just convince them that they're wrong. And that takes weeks, 12 weeks often, to break down in an offender's rhetoric from what they're telling themselves about what they did. And humans in general are designed to do that. If you think about the last time you ate too much at a buffet, you convince yourself all the time that it was justified justified because I had the flu last week, I lost a few pounds, I was starving, I didn't eat lunch, dinner was light. All the reasons that you give yourself permission to drink too much, eat too much, talk too much at a podcast. All of those reasons are the same kind of line that offenders get into their head. The second question is what can be done to help them. First of all, you have to challenge the negative talk, the negative self-talk that they have, that somehow they're justified, and unwind that. And that takes actually quite a bit of time. You have to at least pose the idea that they might be wrong. Once you've done that, then you have a little bit of an opening to try to get through to this is what I could have done different. Also, in an offender's mind, the time period of an incident is quite fast. They look at this part of the cycle. They look at the last 5 minutes, right when the abuser became explosive. That's what they see in their mind. They don't realize all these seemingly meaningless decisions that led up to this point where they got control. And we lay this out. This that I'm drawing, that no one on the area that you listen to this at can see this. But if you think about a mountain, they look at the very peak or the apex of the mountain. They don't see the path towards the mountain, which the journey is often what's most important. So we slow the time frame down. We ask them to start looking over here. What happened a week ago? What happened at work? What happened on your way home? What meaningless decisions did you make to get yourself to this point? So often you have an excuse. I was drinking. I had a bad day at work. I got pulled over by the police. And that it wasn't your fault. This person did this to me and I was just. So we have to slow down the clock. Then we have to give them things to do instead of this. Go take a run. Go call your best friend. Come to group. We have groups every night of the week. You can come to one of them. Right. Call your friends. If you have no friends, call one of the other guys. We have guys who participate in the group long enough that take calls from other guys. There's a lot of different avenues.
But I know you talked about peers earlier. Is it often the peers that break through to a newer abuser?
Yeah,
or a newer
absolutely.
offender?
When an offender sees me, and no matter what I dress like or sound like when I'm in an offender group, they see someone who probably has too much education and is paid too much. That's what I'm sure most offenders think. In fact, I had an offender once call me Queen Elizabeth. And I'm like, interesting.
That is interesting.
Really nice jewelry.
Quite a bit older.
Quite a bit older. And at that point, deceased. So I was like, I need to get up my skincare. I think that they often see people who are intervening in a very negative light. When an offender challenges another offender, that's 1,000 times more valuable. That's somebody who's living the life, not someone with too much education who's paid too much, yammering about domestic violence. And I think that that's gotten even more true the more public my face has gotten. In some of the media, I've had guys bring it up. Well, you're just a media head. And I'm like, I'm actually not. I think that that's what they see. So part of what I do is I take all that down. When you see me in a group, the name under my little box on Zoom is Sara. That's all it says. They don't refer to me as anything fancy. I'm just Sara. And then if they cause trouble, then they learn differently. But some of that, hopefully that will never happen.
That you're indeed fancy.
Well, maybe a little bit more fancier than they might guess by the title Sara.
Thinking about groups, so a lot of people have never experienced what a group is like. It's very different than individual. So I guess the first question is, do you do individual work or is it all group work?
To answer that question, you have to look back at the state standards. Almost universally across the country, group treatment is more effective. It's cheaper, it's safer, and it's more likely to challenge negative behaviors by an offender. Have we ever done individual therapy? Yes. Currently, we do individual therapy when we have a same-sex partner assault. In Missouri, often same-sex offenders are not safe in our heterosexual offender group. Also, the curriculum doesn't translate. Mm-hmm. So we may see someone in a same-sex relationship in a individual format. If someone just absolutely doesn't speak English, having a translator in group for one person is very difficult and distracting for the other members, particularly across Zoom. So if you think about how that would work, you have essentially an interpreter speaking over everyone else. It's nearly impossible to do that. And then you have a value system that may not match ours. And what are the ethics of that? So we try to be very careful with that and provide additional options for people. So we do occasionally. We don't prefer to do that, but there are times when we have to. An additional means that I forgot to list was when a offender has a significant mental health issue, like a major depressive episode, we will refer, and we prefer to refer to someone who has offender treatment experience so they aren't manipulated by the offender into believing that they are somehow the victim in this whole scenario, because that is completely not effective.
Right.
So we do have some situations where we'll use that. It's just not as effective as group.
So you have groups every night.
We do.
Is there a limit, or do you have a certain number that you would have in a group, or do you just take whoever shows up for that night?
It's really hard. As we've expanded across the state, we've really had to challenge that question. One of the things that is difficult is having enough staff to run all the groups. So right now we're a little bit over full. An ideal number is 12, but we sometimes have to run over that. The good news is that there's also a lot of people who don't show on any given night. Offenders are not required to be there. They are required, but we can't force them to show up. So there's a natural attrition that happens most nights. Have we ever had a group of 18 guys or 18 women? Well, yes to guys. We've never had that many women in the program.
So the other thing that I think we get asked a lot too around the abusers is to come into your program, is it all court-ordered or do people come voluntarily?
We do have people come voluntarily and who are court-ordered. The vast majority of our participants are court-ordered. The offenders who are voluntary are a little bit more challenging for us. If you think about what might be going on in a relationship that leads an offender to voluntarily participate in treatment, often it's after an incident when they are very sorry for their behavior and they very much want their survivor to return to, or for them to be able to return home. So they may negotiate to participate in batterer's intervention, and then as soon as the survivor says, sure, you can do X, whatever it is that they want, they'll drop out. What the research supports about that is that they are more violent and more likely to have a more violent incident the next time if they drop out. We lay all that out to our voluntary offenders. Listen, and we also lay that out to the survivor. This is important for you to know. If an offender drops out of treatment, they are more dangerous to you. This isn't a pass to save your relationship. And we really work hard to talk to survivors about that, because when survivors think about an offender participating in treatment, it gives them a lot of hope that they'll get better. What they want is their partner to stop being abusive. They don't want to end the relationship often. And so we want to make sure we don't put the survivor in harm's way. So we lay that out for her. If we take him into group, even though he's voluntary, it may cause you a larger problem later. And we don't have magic wands, although people think that therapists automatically get a magic wand on graduation, like they hit you with it, give you your cap and gown, your diploma, and then hand you a wand. No such wand that I got. Did you?
I want one though.
I know. Well, I bought some like fake wands that I have in my office that I see clients in that I can wave around and say, I didn't get a wand that worked. I think that there's no guarantee that he's going to be Mr. Rogers at the end of the day. And survivors want that so bad.
Right.
They want a partner that doesn't hurt them, which should be like just natural thing that we expect. The challenge is that I can't promise them that. And I want them to know that. I don't want them to stay because that offender is in my group. I want them to stay because they believe that there's something left that's salvageable and that they can be, that's the piece. So we try really hard to make sure they understand that.
What about confidentiality? If there are behaviors that are reported to you, if this is a court-ordered judgment for the offender to be there, I'm assuming it's okay to write a report and be pretty detailed. What if it's not a court-ordered offender?
The truth of the matter is we've done this for a while, so we have a really tight contract. When they agree to participate in our program, they release us to talk to every domestic violence provider, anyone that they may threaten, any representative of the judicial system, their employer, that we are allowed to talk to a variety of individuals. Any individual ever in a relationship, if they call me and ask, we can talk to them about what the offender did and what his participation is like. That's a basic safety protocol. I think a lot of people get into offender work to make money. We're not in it for that. We're in it to help the survivor, and if by the off chance we help the offender change their behavior, that's a perk.
Right.
But I tell offenders not to ask me to testify in court on their behalf because I'll say that. I can't guarantee there's any kind of success. Nationally, research indicates that there is success when you have a committed program that's committed to a particular curriculum, and we are. But there's still the chance that that person will hurt their survivor, and I don't want to convince her that that's okay to stay.
Is there anything that we didn't cover you'd like to bring up or address?
No, I think we had a really exciting conversation, so I appreciate you asking good questions.
Sara, it has been an honor and a privilege to have you on the podcast today. All the information, I'm still processing so much information. Love to have you again. Thanks again for coming.
Come back. Thank you for inviting me.